Greetings, folks, and welcome to a story time. We're reading the book A Journey, an attempt and sometimes struggle at being real in this world. And today we're on episode 18, chapter 21, entitled Kurdistan. And I'm holding off on reading chapter 20 because I'm hoping that today, when she gets home from work, Carol will be willing to read that one. She's given me the impression that she might. So we'll see how that goes. But for now, we're going to be reading Kurdistan. And you may hear in the background a little music going. That's Stanley Jordan, a great guitar player. If you're not familiar with Stanley Jordan, it might be worth looking up. So, here we go with chapter 21, Kurdistan. I'd been working as a paramedic with the fire department for about 6 years on the evening that my wife and I were so rudely interrupted by the episode of horrific back pain and by the nasty medical issues that were causing it. During that 6 year, my boss had started giving me the opportunity to perform some of the tasks a medical officer would normally be performing and to represent the department at some of the meetings an MO would routinely be attending. Our assistant fire chief had for several years, in addition to his chief duties, also been functioning as medical officer. There had been some discussion about filling the position with one of the department's paramedic firefighters, and we had unofficially even discussed the possibility of me perhaps one day being placed in that role. Unfortunately, after the surgery, I was informed that functioning as a paramedic firefighter would no longer be an option. My surgeon had issued a 50-pound lifting restriction, and as any paramedic or firefighter will tell you, there's no way to safely and effectively perform either of those jobs with a 50-pound lifting restriction. During my recovery period, it was determined by administration and by the Board of Commissioners that it was time to fill the medical officer position with someone other than the chief. And surprisingly, it was also decided that I would be a good fit for the job, despite the 50-pound lifting restriction. Wow, rest assured, I realized then, and I still do today, what an unbelievable gift I was being offered. Did I think that I was receiving an undeserved blessing from the fire department and from God? Absolutely, and without question. As wonderful as an opportunity as this was, at my core, I knew it was going to be a big stretch to put on a white shirt and make the shift from being a patient care provider to performing primarily administrative tasks. That first year as medical officer, I still tried to function as a medic on rare occasion so as to maintain some patient contact. This meant, though, that we needed to be sure to have enough bodies available on the scene to do any often necessary heavy lifting. It was possible to function this way, but I never did feel comfortable with having to rely on someone else to perform the lifting that every medic should be able to perform. About a year after the surgery, the original surgery, while at a routine follow-up visit with the surgeon, and after having the first of many annual CT scans, the doc gave me the news that my descending aorta had gotten bigger in diameter, and a second surgery would need to be performed. Bummer. This go-round, they would be wrapping, I think with Dacron, about 4 inches of the big artery that flows blood from the heart down. It would be much like the procedure performed on the ascending aorta, except without the extra added bonus of having to put in a heart valve. Another thing that would be a little different about the second surgery was that instead of going in through the chest, they needed to go in from behind. This meant removing a rib from my back in order to gain access. I asked to keep the rib as a souvenir after surgery, thinking it would be fun to engrave it with something from Genesis and give it to Carol. Something from chapter 2 where it talks about God taking a rib from Adam and using it to make Eve. Dang, the hospital wasn't willing to let me have it. Looking back, I can imagine that Carol was probably about this time wondering why in the world she ever made the mistake of marrying this strange army guy from Washington after only a 3-day engagement. 3 kids, a hip replacement, a big heart surgery, and now another big heart surgery later, she was again having to figure out how to take care of the kids and at the same time travel to and from Seattle to spend time with me in the ICU. And all this nonsense being generated from a guy who she thought was really healthy when she married him. I thought I was really healthy. Thank you, God, for the wonderful friends and neighbors who helped her out during this time. Carol tells the story of one of those days in the ICU when I must have been pretty heavily medicated. Apparently, while sitting up in the bed, I closed my eyes, pinched my thumb and index finger together, placed them to my lips, and took a long, slow drag as if enjoying a toke. I have absolutely no recollection of this event, but it does go to show how some old habits die pretty hard. Having been a military guy, a fire service guy, and a dad with young kids, smoking pot wasn't even in my vocabulary at all. It would have been well over 20 years since I partook in herbal medicine, and yet, surprise, surprise, over 2 decades later, here I was, thinking I'm taking a hit in the intensive care. Although Washington State is considered by some to be the most liberal state in all of the United States, and although along with Colorado was one of the first 2 states to legalize marijuana, I don't believe you'll find any of the intensive care units providing joints to their patients. On the other hand, it is Washington. Just like with my first surgery, recovery ultimately went quite well, and I was back to work before too terribly long. Back to work also meant getting back into the groove of attending meetings, lots of meetings. Although there were meetings, maybe several of them, that had you wondering if everybody's time and effort couldn't be better spent doing something else, there were, thankfully, some that actually made a valuable contribution and difference in our county's emergency medical system. In addition to having the pleasure of attending lots of meetings, I was also tasked with coordinating and teaching our fire academy's emergency medical technician course. Students included members of our own department's resident program, residents from other area departments, and some students who came to us via the local community college. It was fun to see these mostly young adults learn new information and master new skills. Particularly gratifying to me was working with the students who really did have a heart to take care of their patients, which, come to think of it, was most of them. Part of my little spiel with each new class was a reminder that they would be in the business of providing patient care, and that in order to provide patient care, you'd first have to actually give a rip about the patient. It would also be really, really good to actually care. If you didn't care, perhaps the field of emergency medical service wasn't the best choice for a career. So here I was, staying busy doing lots of stuff, talking about, teaching about, planning about, and going to meetings about the business of taking care of patients. The problem was, I was just about never actually doing it. Just about never, except for on those forthcoming occasions when I was given the wonderful gift of participating with a medical relief team. A few years after coming on with the fire department, I had applied to volunteer with a faith-based NGO, or non-government agency, which had its headquarters outside of Portland, Oregon, and which provided medical and disaster relief all over the globe. When Carol and I decided that Vietnam was not the direction we were going to take, I did find myself wondering if and when serving in an international setting might ever be a reality. Just when I was starting to think it probably wasn't going to happen anytime soon, particularly after having had the heart surgeries, hello, I get an invitation to travel to, of all places, Iraq. On this particular team, we wouldn't actually be performing hands-on patient care, but rather would be sent to evaluate the nursing programs being taught in the north of the country, and specifically in the three major Kurdish cities of the region, Erbil, Sulaymaniyah, and Duhok. Any specific areas of medical care we identified as ones that could use some continuing education would be considered for future teams to come and teach on. The trip was taking place just about 2 months after the United States made its invasion on Iraq and on Saddam Hussein. I should probably mention here that I was one of those very skeptical people concerning whether or not an invasion of Iraq should have ever taken place. It was pretty clear Mr. Hussein was a horribly bad fellow, responsible for several years of terrible atrocities, which included, among other things, the use of chemicals to annihilate untold thousands of Kurdish villagers in the north of the country. That was a given. As to whether or not he was actually harboring chemical weapons at the time of the U.S. invasion, that was another story. Although a wholehearted supporter of the men and women who serve as members of our military, I was not in support of invading Iraq at that time. I was very much in support, however, of an opportunity to help some of the people of Iraq in any way we could. Journal entry, 5/28 of 2003. Wow, Father, I can hardly believe that I'm here. Arrived in Portland for a 3 p.m. briefing with NWMT, that's Northwest Medical Teams. We are scheduled to fly on in the morning, destination San Francisco, California. From there we go to Frankfurt and spend the night. Hopefully Gerhardt and Roland will come to visit at the hotel. Gerhardt and Roland were old friends from the Contact Club I was a part of while stationed in Germany. We had all kept in touch over the years, and I let them know I'd be in Frankfurt for a night and would love to get together. Lord, I truly don't deserve to be here. Please help me to be an asset to this team. We have 2 docs, Bob and Dick, 1 RN, Marie, and myself. This is so awesome. Called Carol and the kids a little bit ago. Please, Lord, take care of them and let them know your presence. I think this is the longest that I've ever been away from Carol. She really is a wonderful woman. Over the years, I've been given the huge privilege of being able to take some vacations with my family. Usually, these little getaways lasted a few days, or at the longest, a couple weeks, except for the trip to Vietnam, which was 3 weeks. The trip to Iraq would require being away from Carol and the kids for just over 3 weeks. Somehow, when I received the invitation to go, there was enough paid time off available to actually pull it off. I hadn't yet returned to full duty after the second surgery, and there weren't any pressing MO tasks that wouldn't wait or that couldn't be taken care of by another department member. I would be functioning more as a nurse than a paramedic, so the 50-pound lifting restriction wasn't going to be an issue. Dear Carol had agreed to hold down the fort and take care of the kids by herself while I was away, albeit a little apprehensively. So when all was said and done, much to my surprise, I got to go. Journal entry, 5/31, 10:40, Frankfurt Airport. Hello, Lord. Well, here we are at the airport. Yesterday was wonderful. Gerhardt and Roland came and met me at the hotel. We took a ride to the Tanis Mountains, hills, and went up to the highest one, Feldberg. You get a view of Frankfurt from there. We then went out to dinner in the town of Königstein. What a cool place. Old style cobblestone streets and a castle on the hill. I think it might have actually been an old fortress where a castle had once stood. We had dinner outside on the street and it was awesome. I couldn't have asked for anything better. Rouladen, that's a wonderful braised beef roll stuffed with goodies like bacon and onions and mustard and pickle. Yummy. Red cabbage, potato dumplings, and Hefeweizen. There was no way I was going to eat this amazing German meal without a good German beer. Some folks going to a rehearsal for a castle festival walked by in costume. It was a blast. What a wonderful highlight to my trip, having Gerhardt and Roland take the time to pay me a visit during our layover and also to treat me to this amazing dinner. It was way above and beyond what I could have imagined to be sitting with my old friends and enjoying a delicious meal in the village of Königstein, where from our cobblestone street table we could gaze up at the old castle fortress on the hill. Oh, and then the people in old world costume came strolling by, just in case we were lacking atmosphere. It was so great. From Frankfurt we flew into the city of Diyarbakir, located in the southeastern Republic of Turkey. Diyarbakir, unofficially considered the capital of Turkish Kurdistan, is also known for its massive medieval walls that surround the city. At 10 to 12 meters in height, 3 to 5 meters wide, and nearly 6 kilometers in length, the fortification is second only to the Great Wall of China in size. After a night in Diyarbakir, we traveled by van to the border town of Salopi, where, after a several-hour process, we made the crossing into Iraq. Journal entry 6-3. Father God, I really can't believe that you allowed me to be part of this team. Thank you very much. We started the day by visiting with the Minister of Health of Kurdistan, Mr. Jamal Abdul Manad, who has his office in Erbil. We then traveled to Duhok, where we met the director of Duhok School of Medicine, Dr. Farhad. From there, we went to the director of health in Duhok. Tomorrow, we will go to the teaching hospital for an orientation with the director of the hospital and a tour of the different departments. More journal entries, 6-5. We have now been in Duhok for 3 days and have met everyone from the director of the School of Nursing, the director of health, director of Azadi, director of the emergency hospital, the nursing director of the technical school, a wonderful woman that reminds you of Mother Teresa, and the planning manager for the Duhok Department of Health, to name a few. I can't remember exactly what it was about the director of the technical school that made me think of Mother Teresa. It may have been the combination of her obvious and genuine concern for others, along with the little twinkle in her eyes. While in northern Iraq, our group first met with the appropriate medical powers that be in Duhok, Sulaymaniyah, and Erbil. After making all the required introductions, we visited several hospitals and medical schools in those same cities with the goal of putting together a list of medical topics which small teaching teams could develop curriculum for and then later return to the country to teach. Although I never did see the final report, I know that some of the needs we identified included topics as simple as basic life support, CPR, and basic infection control, to more complex areas such as advanced cardiac life support, advanced trauma life support, and burn care. I wasn't one of those privileged to later join one of the teaching teams. However, I believe that several small groups did come and provide some much-needed continuing education. Our trip to Iraq was, I believe, valuable and did ultimately help to facilitate better medicine and nursing care in the cities which we visited. In addition to lending a helping hand, I had hoped that after spending some time in the country, I might be able to determine with a little more clarity if our military invasion of Iraq really was a good and necessary decision or not. Like many people, I was very confused about the reports we were hearing at home of Hussein having a huge stockpile of hidden chemical weapons. He had, of course, already proved his willingness to possess and use this kind of weaponry in the past, but the evidence being presented proving that he still had anything hidden away was, from my perspective, pretty weak at best. It just so happened that our in-country contact and guide while traveling from city to city, we'll call him Dale, was the same person who had been tasked with coordinating and building a number of chemical shelters in the northern Kurdish areas of the country. According to him, everybody he was associated with was, for the most part, convinced that Hussein did not have a stockpile of chemical and/or biological weapons. Also, according to our guide, for Hussein to confirm one way or the other if he did or didn't have these weapons at his disposal, as opposed to keeping the world guessing and giving the impression that he was in control, would cause him to lose face and appear weak, something the megalomaniac dictator of an Arab nation is probably not in the habit of doing. Although pretty sure that Saddam Hussein was not harboring weapons of mass destruction, our guide also realized that he was a crazy man, and that building shelters just in case was a very reasonable thing to do. Another issue that was, for me, kind of a ridiculous proposition was the idea that after liberating the nation of Iraq from its insane leader, those holding power would for some reason be interested in developing a Western democratic form of government. Why would a land which had functioned under a very tribal form of government for thousands of years now choose to do things our way? In addition to the struggle that exists between Sunnis and Shias, Iraq is also home to powerful tribal sheiks who probably have little to no interest in changing the way they rule or in losing any of the power and position they possess. And it's not like the different factions of Kurds were asking for a democratic form of government. Their differences had even led to a civil war in the mid-1990s between the PDK, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, and the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. And there was also the PKK, the Workers' Party, to add to the mix. The point is, at least to my simple way of thinking, the people of Iraq were not going to suddenly change a centuries way old of governing. And if I may, I'm going to turn this thing off and go flip the album over. All right, hello, back again. Oh, by the way, if I haven't mentioned it, it's a beautiful sunny day here in the Pacific Northwest and frosty. It's pretty cold out. So it's a beautiful fall day. Journal entry, 6:15, 7:45 p.m. Well, it's now Sunday the 15th, and I'm back in Erbil, due to leave for the border in the morning. Felt kind of punked today, but thank you, Lord, seems to be getting better. I must write this while I'm thinking about it. Carol, an Australian who works for the State Department, had a large amount of money stolen from her home by the house cleaner. In order to write it off, she needs to file a police report. The father of the girl said that if Carol does file a report, he would kill his daughter in front of her. Kind of a dilemma. Not sure how it's going to work out. I think Dale will write a letter for her so it can be documented, and at the same time the family won't be ashamed. A very different culture. So different that I wonder if the U.S. attempt to establish a Western form of government could ever work. I wonder if George didn't bite off a little more than the U.S. can chew. After completing our assignment in Iraq, I said goodbye to the team and traveled independently by car back to the Turkish border and then on to Istanbul and finally home. Before leaving the country, though, I had a chance to spend a couple nights at our guide's home in Erbil. It was while staying with Dale that I was invited to dinner at his friend's house who worked for the State Department and who told us the story about her housekeeper. Losing face, it would appear, was not just a major issue for Saddam Hussein, but also for the father of Carol's housekeeper. Hearing the story only further convinced me that a tribal form of government with an overriding culture of honor over shame at all costs was not going to easily or even ever be willing or able to conform to Western democracy. Before closing this chapter on Kurdistan, I want to mention that during the course of our travels in the north of Iraq, we would sometimes need to drive through the city of Mosul. Although Mosul wasn't at that time a city under siege, it was a place that our guide knew would be best to avoid and to travel through only if absolutely necessary, and then very quickly without stopping. It was after finding out that I would be going to Iraq and then making an effort to research and gain a little more knowledge about the country that I discovered a surprising fact about Mosul. Most everybody has heard the story of Jonah and the big fish. You know the one. A guy named Jonah is told by God to go to the city of Nineveh and make it clear to its inhabitants that he, God, was not at all pleased about their wicked ways. Instead of doing what God had told him to do, Jonah decides not to get involved and instead goes to the port of Joppa, where he finds passage on his ship to Tarshish. There seems to be some debate as to exactly where the city of Tarshish was located in the time of Jonah, but whatever the case, it was nowhere near Nineveh and not at all in the direction Jonah had been told to go. So simply put, he was running away. Well, during the voyage, they were hit by a huge storm which starts to break up the ship. After some investigating by the captain and the sailors on board, it comes out that Jonah was running from God, and is very likely the reason for their woes. They all agree that the best thing to do is to throw Jonah overboard in hopes that it will quiet the storm. Immediately after giving him the old heave-ho, the storm stops its raging, and the ship, along with its occupants, are spared. All spared except for Jonah, who finds himself bobbing around in the middle of the sea. This is where the fish comes in. A really big one swallows Jonah up, and it's inside the big fish's belly that Jonah makes his home for the next 3 days and nights, along with whatever nasty things you would find in the stomach of a fish big enough to swallow you up. Horribly slimy comes to my mind. Jonah's stay at Hotel Big Fish did provide him with an opportunity to seriously contemplate life, as well as to have a really good prayer time with the God he'd been trying to run away from. Apparently, Jonah wasn't very easy to digest because after the 3 days, he got puked up onto a beach. So much for running away from God. Jonah received another word from on high, but this time was instructed not just to let the people of Nineveh know that the Lord of the universe was pretty ticked off about their evil and violent ways, but also that in 40 days, all of its inhabitants were going to be overthrown. This time around, Jonah was a little more amiable to doing what God had asked him to do, and after a 3-day walk to Nineveh, he proclaimed God's message all over the city. You'd think that Jonah would have been pleased when the king and all the people heeded his words and everybody fasted and prayed, asking God to help them to turn from their wicked ways. It wasn't just all the people that fasted, prayed, and covered themselves with sackcloth and ashes, but not even the animals were given food, and they too received a sackcloth covering. It really ticked Jonah off that God listened to the prayers of the people, changed his mind, and decided not to wipe them out. Turns out the reason Jonah didn't want to go to Tarshish in the first place was because he had a feeling that God would be loving and forgive the people if they repented. I won't go into details here, but the biblical account ends with God teaching Jonah a lesson about love and forgiveness. The book of Jonah tells the whole story. It's only 4 chapters long and found between Obadiah and Micah. The point I'm mentioning this is that the city of Nineveh is, in fact, the city of Mosul today. Pretty cool, I'd say. Iraq is so incredibly full of wonderful historical sites. You may recall when early in the U.S. involvement of Iraq, an American military convoy was ambushed when they entered the Iraqi-occupied town of Nasiriyah. Several soldiers were killed or wounded, and then several were taken into captivity as prisoners of war. It was headline news when one of the wounded captives was rescued by special forces from Saddam Hussein Hospital in the town of Nasiriyah, where she was being held. It just so happens that Nasiriyah is located very near to what was known as the city of Ur. That's the place Abraham originally came from when he was told to leave his home and set out for the Promised Land. Kind of a significant place. Other well-known historical sites located in Iraq include Babylon, where, as the story goes, ancient Mesopotamians tried to build a giant tower reaching into heaven. Apparently, they were hoping their efforts to build what we've come to know as the Tower of Babel would impress God and show him how resourceful they were. Instead of being impressed, the chief architect of the cosmos decided to put a stop to their project by confusing the people's speech and causing them to speak in several languages rather than the one tongue they'd all been using. Construction was shut down due to folks no longer being able to understand each other. Although historians differ as to its location, Babylon may also have been the place where one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens, once stood. I was very surprised to learn that the capital of Kurdistan, Erbil, where we spent a great deal of our time in Iraq, is considered to be the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Outside of Erbil's citadel, or Kalat, I believe it's pronounced, which sits in the heart of and at the city's highest elevation, you can find a very unpretentious hand-painted sign that gives a brief history and makes a claim of being an inhabited community since 7000 BC. The day we visited the citadel, there was a car parked in front of the sign, making it difficult to read and photograph. At the suggestion of Dale, we stealthily pulled the sign up out of the ground, moved it over to a place where it could be easily read, and took a couple photos, and then returned it to its happy home. Probably a good thing no one else was around when we tampered with the official sign at the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. My return trip home for the most part was uneventful, except maybe for the delay our plane full of passengers experienced while waiting on the airstrip in Diyarbakir, destination Istanbul. After what seemed like an inordinately long wait, the overhead speaker on the plane instructed the owner of a green duffel bag to disembark. I had chosen to travel with my old Army-issue duffel bag because it was a pretty practical travel bag and could also be worn as a backpack. Other than a red bandana wrapped around the handle and a tiny little WWJD iron-on patch, it was just a regular old Army-style bag. I don't know if it was just the fact that it was military or what, but before it got put on in the plane's luggage compartment, they wanted to be sure about who it belonged to. After walking down the rolling staircase to the airstrip below, there sat my bag all by itself on the tarmac. A few guys met me at the bottom of the staircase, asked me to verify the bag was mine, and that was it. I got back on the plane, a little embarrassed for having been the reason for our delay, and soon after we were in the air. Accompanying a medical team to Iraq was a privilege. I would forever, here, let me reread that. Accompanying a medical team to Iraq was a privilege I would forever be grateful for. It was very surprising and exciting to have been invited in the first place. Maybe even a bigger surprise was that this wasn't the only invite I would receive. In the years to come, although we would all wish there were never the need for a disaster response in the first place, I was asked to and ultimately did participate with teams that provided medical care to both West Darfur, Sudan, and then Banda Aceh, Indonesia. Once again, due to the willingness of my fire chiefs to allow me to be away for several weeks each time, along with the generous vacation time the fire service offers, augmented by a few of my co-workers donating a little of their hard-earned vacation time to help make it possible for one of their own to lend a hand across the globe, I was able to serve on those medical missions. One of my chiefs even kicked in some of his vacation time. I could only hope and pray that I would represent our department and the folks who contributed several hours from their own personal time off really well during those opportunities to serve. For both trips, I left the duffel bag at home. So, that concludes Kurdistan. And our next go-round, we'll be looking at Chapter 22, From Africa to Indonesia. All right. Well, thanks very much. Once again, I hope this is at all worthwhile for somebody out there. And thanks for listening. Adios.